lecture titled Mass Incarceration as Misnomer, Domestic Warfare and the Renovations of the Racist State. He's a professor and the chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. He's the author of Forced Passages, Imprisoned Radical Intellectuals in the U.S. Prison Regime, and Suspended Apocalypse, White Supremacy, Genocide, and the Filipino Condition. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I should make sure that I thank Diversify. How many folks in the room are with or work with or alongside or in affiliation and affinity with the student organization Diversify, just out of curiosity? Okay. Thank you to Diversify folks for bringing me, the anthropology department that helped co-sponsor, and especially Meredith Mathis for bringing me out. I want to interject real quick and dedicate the next hour or so of my lecture to you, to the ongoing work that a number of students here have been engaging in, multiple generations of students here have been engaging in, to bring some version of ethnic, gender, and queer studies to this campus. Reed College, I noticed, very much brands itself as a diversity campus. I think it's a complete travesty and it's completely reprehensible that there's no such thing as gender, racial, ethnic, queer studies at this campus. And I encourage all of you to get engaged in some supportive way to make that happen here. The lack of it is really, really appalling to me. And of course, I put my money where my mouth is on stuff like that, as somebody who's been in some version of ethnic studies for my entire scholarly life. Any work that unfolds here, any support that you need, I'm here for you. Call on me, and I'm just, not that far away. I'm a 4-hour flight away. So I just want to make sure that you all are aware that this is an important issue here at Reed. So I open with an accusation that the now common use of the phrase mass incarceration composes the most recent historical example of the symbiotic political cultures of liberal to progressive state reform and liberal multiculturalism, affirming the logics of white supremacist denial. Mass incarceration, the phrase, is simultaneously a flimsy liberal euphemism and an empirical or descriptive inaccuracy. This is to say, there is and has been no such thing as mass incarceration, and to continually assert its occurrence is to be accomplice to a denial of social holocaust that identifies, separates, and neutralizes targeted populations by way of civil and social death rather than physical and biological death. At the very least, mass incarceration has become a keyword in the unfolding political genealogy of post-racialism, wherein racial terror as a form of violence that profiles and disselects its objects is misnarrated through rhetorics of shared grievance, universal outrage, and liberal humanist alarm. Thus, the problem is not merely that terms like mass incarceration, police brutality, school-to-prison pipeline, you've heard these phrases everywhere. School-to-prison pipeline has become a kind of a linchpin of the nonprofit foundation, liberal, 501c3 industry, to the point where it's as universal as the phrase mass incarceration is. But these phrases are not only misleading, inaccurate, and obscuring of what can only be named as the paradigmatic asymmetries that are formed in the gendered racist state-making, state-building, nation-building of the United States, but also that these terms work to displace other kinds of scholarly, theoretical, and insurgent activist languages of revolt, such as, by way of example, the terminologies of domestic warfare, racist state violence, anti-Black genocide, police terror, settler colonial occupation, among others. All terms which you hear far less often, far less frequently, and which have not been inscribed into the kind of post-racial common sense language. The social truth of contemporary criminalization, policing, incarceration nexus is inseparable from the regimes of chattel enslavement, manifest destiny genocide, American apartheid, and colonialist and neo-colonialist conquest. Gendered racial and racial colonial technologies of human incarceration. And for our conversation today, I want you to understand the term, the concept incarceration as systems of capture and forced confinement that are not only limited to jailing and imprisonment. So I want to think about how technologies of human incarceration are shared across the so-called free world institutions of the jail, prison, internment camp, reservation, school, factory, housing project, and asylum, among others. In the shadow of this looming archive of racist carceral statecraft and genocidal nation building, the language of mass incarceration has become the polite resignification of mass black incarceration, and in certain geographies, mass brown incarceration, by way of a post-racialist vernacular. The strategic, tacit disavowal of race, gendered racial criminalization, and racist national culture from the signifying order of critical, progressive, and even avowedly leftist engagements with the carceral regime, in turn naturalizes the long historical fact of white decriminalization, decarceration, and constitutive innocence. In other words, what you hear all the time are liberal, progressive, leftist lamentations mourning about the over-incarceration, the racial profiling, the targeting of black, brown, queer, etc., subaltern groups, but never a coherent conversation about how white people are radically decriminalized, right? That's an adjacent but very different conversation that makes people uncomfortable. The recent invocations of the phrase mass incarceration almost entirely refuse to address the long historical constitution of white life as consistently, materially, and symbolically dependent on a militarized order of freedom that requires the subsuming of other forms of life and being to various antisocial formations of displacement, evisceration, and extinction. The discourse of mass incarceration, while often appropriated, that is re-signified, so to speak, by abolitionist, anti-racist, and black radical practitioners, such as you see the image on the top right of a man at a protest, at a mobilization, in which he's modified the phrase mass incarceration in a pretty fundamental way, naming it as mass black incarceration. But despite all of these appropriations, the phrase mass incarceration, the discursive field, the cultural exchange around the phrase mass incarceration still undeniably, persistently lends itself to the absurdities of white and multiculturalist liberalism. That is, it incites outraged analyses and activist rhetorics that rest on notions of unfairness, systemic bias, racial disparity, and institutional dysfunction that in turn demand vigorous reforms of the state, largely by way of internal auditing, aggressive legal and policy shifts, and rearrangements of infrastructure. So you see this on the images here as well, in terms of the ways that the Brennan Center and the Louisiana Progressive, right there on the left and in the middle, have mobilized the phrase of mass incarceration. The image on the bottom right is just another example of how it is that academic institutions, scholarly formations use the phrase. And I spoke at that conference, so I'm implicated in this entire thing too. That was just a couple of years ago. We must therefore, in fact, that conference is what got me thinking about this criticism that I'm giving to you all tonight. So we must ask ourselves what the phrase mass incarceration has actually come to mean, to what uses that phrase is being deployed, and whether in our incessant and perhaps under-theorized use of this phrase, we are becoming unwitting accomplices to precisely that which some of us profess to be radically opposed. We're obligated to challenge and disrupt what I believe has become an insidious ideological concoction, one that, as I'm hoping I'll demonstrate in the next minutes, has quickly been fully incorporated into the language of the racial and racist US state, and which is bubbling at the base of an emerging liberal to progressive common sense around policing, criminalization, and human capture. What's worth saying over and over again is that it is not the undifferentiated mass that's being criminalized and held captive, but rather a selective, particular, and absolutely identifiable set of human groups and bodies that's being targeted by this contemporary regime of state violence, at least 4 decades in the making. They, we are black. They, we are poor. They, we are brown. They, we are undocumented. They, we are transgender. They, we are queer. They, we are cisgender men and increasingly cisgender women. We could go on. Further, once we begin to demystify the alleged mass in mass incarceration, there unfold the extended degrees of disruption, alienation, and structured suffering produced by this gendered racist carceral regime. State-induced damages that are largely incalculable despite the best efforts of our most radical criminologists and grassroots activists. A brief genealogy is in order. While it's possible to trace the origins of the phrase further back in time, the contemporary iteration of mass incarceration emerged with particular coherence in the mid-1990s, especially in response to the work of the 34-member National Criminal Justice Commission between 1994 and 1996. In other words, this phrase didn't just emerge in the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years. It's about 20 years in the making in terms of its current iteration. The National NCJC, National Criminal Justice Commission, the commission's agenda was to produce an expository analysis of and set of policy recommendations for what it then called, and remember this is 1996, quote, the largest and most frenetic correctional buildup of any country in the history of the world. So this is 1996, right? This is before the war on terror is declared, before Donald Trump decides he's going to deport everybody and build walls and fucking obliterate everybody in the United States that doesn't look like him. This is before any of that happened. So this is 20 years ago. And also if you look at who composed the commission, these are not radical criminologists. Okay, these are fairly mainstream elected officials, kind of think tank folks, academics, and others. So they're naming it in a kind of renaissance moment of the U.S. prison industrial complex as that kind of so-called correctional buildup. So the commission's work at that time, in the mid-90s, was far-reaching, it was global, and its research and analytical labors culminated in the publication of what became a widely cited report by HarperCollins titled The Real War on Crime. You see it right there on the slide. This was an influential text, and much of its analysis and conclusions still remain useful 20 years later. The Commission's critical criminological approach was only one of the most prominent examples of a field of amplified challenges to the U.S. and global carceral criminalization regimes that was encompassed by a spectrum of anti-prison, carceral and penal abolitionist, prison moratorium, and human rights activisms throughout the latter 1990s into the 2000s. I was one of the rank and file founding members of an organization called Critical Resistance that was kind of created in 1997, culminated in a series of conferences, and was one of the, I think, central organizations in popularizing the concept of abolition, the language of abolition, both for better and for worse into 2016. Notably, the term mass incarceration persisted throughout this period, meaning the last 20 years, surfacing in both activist and grassroots rhetorics, as well as influential texts like the anthology you see in the middle, the one co-edited by Mark Maurer and Mita Chesney-Lind in 2002, titled Invisible Punishment, The Collateral Consequences of Mass Imprisonment. And of course, more recently, Professor Michelle Alexander's widely read, and as I'll talk about it, deeply flawed book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. How many of y'all have seen, read some section, some portion of Michelle Alexander's book? Just out of curiosity. Given the influence of Professor Alexander's book among various communities and publics, from progressive black churches and abolitionist activists to public policy think tanks and government officials, it is worth reflecting on the narrative arc that her book instills alongside its lucid conception of an era of carceral racial segregation. Alexander's text famously proposes a historical analogy that views the emergence of the post-1970s mass incarceration era as, quote, the new Jim Crow, while ultimately asserting, near the end of the text, that this contemporary condition that we inhabit, in fact, cannot be substantively equilibrated to Jim Crow, contending that, and these are Professor Alexander's words, quote, although the parallels between the two systems of control are striking, it's more important to understand that there are important differences. That's on page 195 if you don't believe me. End quote. What I want to critically engage with you all for the next couple minutes is not necessarily Professor Alexander's cataloging of the institutional cultural political differences between the obviously different racist state regimes of Jim Crow segregation and post-Jim Crow racial incarceration. In other words, I think Professor Alexander is absolutely correct when she asserts, quote, that the list of the differences between Jim Crow and mass incarceration might well be longer than the list of similarities, end quote. I don't question that. Instead, what I want to call into question are Professor Alexander's methodological and political choices, particularly the one that attempts to conceptualize so-called mass incarceration through the use of Jim Crow segregation as a tool of historical analogy, rather than through the more robust concept of institutional genealogy and historical continuity. Okay, let me try to elaborate what I mean by this. Professor Alexander throws New Jim Crow out there. It's a catchy title. It's an almost seemingly self-narrating, symbolic adjournment to incarceration, so-called mass incarceration, and yet she abandons it, right? So what I want to raise here is, what if we took a more historicized approach to the logics of power, domination, particularly of racist state violence, that underwrite and reproduce what we have started calling mass incarceration, and trace it to Jim Crow and maybe beyond Jim Crow as a continuity, right? What if the logics of power and domination remain fairly consistent, even though the institutional forms that articulate that power and domination change dramatically? You follow me? If you don't, then hopefully the next few minutes will help clarify. For example, what would it mean to epistemically, theoretically, analytically center the long present tense of anti-Black and racist state violence in our analysis of the contemporary racist states' policing and carceral technologies? What if contemporary policing, I'm distinguishing policing from incarceration for sure. What if contemporary policing as a social historical power relation, and not merely a self-contained exercise of state power, was understood through a tracing of its systemic, cultural, legal, and militarized roots in the white supremacist, nationalist voluntarism and racist masculinity of slave patrols, frontier rangers, the Ku Klux Klan, and border vigilantes? It's in raising these kinds of questions that there becomes an urgent need to identify and refute the strangely optimistic racial historical telos that mars the concluding pages of Professor Alexander's New Jim Crow. In apparent contradiction with much of the evidence outlined in the prior chapters of the book, literally hundreds of pages, Alexander alleges that the recent historical period is marked by, quote, an absence of overt racial hostility, end quote, among elected officials and other politicians, law enforcement officials, and so forth, as well as an absence of overt racial hostility within the public discourse more generally. It's on page 197. It's in this vein that Alexander undermines the potential force of hers and others' descriptions of so-called mass incarceration. One of the most disappointing facets of the book is its somewhat bizarre repetition of the familiar liberal post-civil rights, so-called post-racial celebration of American racial progress. Sorry, I hate reading long quotes, but this one's worth it. This is Professor Alexander's book, page 197. Even granting that some African Americans may fear the police today as much as their grandparents feared the Klan, and that the penal system may be as brutal in many respects as Jim Crow or slavery, the absence of racial hostility in the public discourse and the steep decline in vigilante racial violence is no small matter. It is also significant that the whites-only signs are gone and that children of all colors can drink from the same water fountains, swim in the same pools, and play on the same playgrounds. Black children today can even dream of being president of the United States. Those who claim that mass incarceration is just like Jim Crow make a serious mistake. Things have changed. Professor Alexander's puzzling assertion of an absence of racial hostility in the public discourse is at least historically inaccurate, if not politically reprehensible. On the one hand, this cavalier assertion grossly misestimates the post-1960s reawakening and expansion of organized white supremacist movements and ideologies, evidenced by the tripling of KKK membership during the decade of the 70s, as noted in the late Manning Marable's now classic book, Race, Reform, and Rebellion. On the other hand, and more fundamentally, I question whether it is, in fact, the Jim Crow power relation that should be centered in examining the genealogy of the contemporary U.S. incarceration regime. How might we take seriously, for example, the possibility that the power relations formed by anti-Black racial genocide and proto-genocide of transatlantic racial chattel slavery are in fact a paradigmatic power formation that consistently structures the changing discourses, the changing institutional forms of the racist state more generally, including the contemporary U.S. criminalization, policing, and carceral apparatuses. In fact, one of the foundational power relations of the modern state and its punitive criminal justice apparatus has been its juridical designation of the convicted person as the bodily property of the state, a being eviscerated of civil existence, including alienation from the regimes of civil and human rights. Recall as well that it is through the technology of racial and racist criminalization, especially in the context of the post-emancipation, what the great W.E.B. Du Bois would call the post-Black Reconstruction period of American white supremacist renaissance, that the convicted being is designated as actually available for involuntary servitude. I think what might be useful to drive my point home, to maybe anchor our challenge to the phrase mass incarceration, is a rereading and brief retelling of the text and animus of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, commonly valorized as the decree that abolished plantation slavery. Y'all familiar with the 13th Amendment? Yeah, I see a bunch of nodding heads. That's a good thing. Bear with me, nodding heads. 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. What we find here is that the 13th Amendment refurbishes the racist state by transparently recodifying the terms of bodily capture and subjection that is slavery. The symbiotic cultural and state technologies of contemporary racial criminalization, now I'm stretching what I mean by contemporary, I'm talking about the 20th into the 21st centuries. Contemporary racial criminalization has both inherited and actively weaponized the historical technologies of the slave ship, coffle, and auction block as the leverage points through which the so-called duly convicted are made available for enslavement. The slave relation itself is not abolished, but is instead reanimated through the regime of incarceration. A huge body of scholarship, I'll just point to this. I'm thinking about people like, of course, Angela Davis, colleagues of mine that are publishing articles and books now. I'll throw some names out like Sarah Haley, Dennis Childs, more well-known folks, senior level people like Colin Diane, Marcus Rediker, Khalil Muhammad, David Oshinsky, a bunch of people. A huge body of scholarship. I'll send you all a syllabus if you want, or a bibliography if you want. This body of scholarship shows how the unfolding of the U.S. carceral regime over the course of this particular last half century, that is since the 1970s, early 70s, latter 60s, reflects a political legitimation and reinvigoration of slavery's logic of anti-black racial genocide. This logic has been reformed, not abolished, to fit the changing mandates of the post-slavery, post-civil rights, and now post-racial and multiculturalist American nation-building project. This is why there is no such thing as an undifferentiated mass incarceration, just as there was no such thing as an undifferentiated mass racial chattel enslavement. Nobody fucking says mass slavery, right? Right? It would be absurd, it would be insulting, and it would, that would be just a travesty to even try to say anything like that. I think we need to insist, at the very least, on a precision and critical accuracy in our terminology. Terminologies, I should say, plural terminologies. Activist, scholarly, academic, pedagogical, artistic, otherwise. If there's to be any possibility of adequately engaging the problem we've each differently inherited and inhabited. So I've raised the critique of Alexander's book because it's been since the time of the New Jim Crow's publication in 2010 that the life of the phrase has gotten a little weird. While my own critical reading of the life of the term mass incarceration tells me that its usage throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s did often mesh with radical conceptions of low-intensity domestic warfare and racist state violence, the more recent uses of the phrase have veered into the auto-critiques and self-instituted reforms of the racial and racist state. What happens, I'm asking you, when the racial state listens to, absorbs, and predictably rearticulates the analytical rhetorics of mass incarceration? Right? So I want to give you 3 prominent examples of the racial state doing exactly this that span less than 10 months from each other. And please bear with me because I know it's painful watching some of this. Attorney General Eric Holder's keynote address for the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School in September 2014 was one of the first indications of a reformist shift in the national paradigm. Though in Holder's terms, the problem is not mass incarceration, but rather over-incarceration. So you see this brief moment where these major figures, organic intellectuals of the racial state, are still teetering on the edge of whether they're going to start using the phrase that activists are starting to use. Right? So he says over-incarceration. In the aftermath of the uprisings in Ferguson, it's notable that Holder's reformist rhetoric remains firmly allied with the policing industrial complex, even as he voices the need to revamp elements of the prison industrial complex. I'm going to give you a short passage from this.
Far too long, under well-intentioned policies designed to be tough on criminals, our system has perpetuated a destructive cycle of poverty, of criminality, and of incarceration that has trapped countless people and weakened entire communities. particularly communities of color. Now, in recent decades, the effects of these policies and the impact of the truth in sentencing mindset have really been dramatic. Although the United States comprises just 5% of the world's population, we incarcerate almost a quarter of the world's prisoners. The entire United States population has increased by about a third since 1980, but the federal prison population has grown by almost 800% over the same period. Spending on corrections, incarceration, and law enforcement has exploded, consuming $260 billion per year nationwide. And the Bureau of Prisons currently commands about a third of the United States Justice Department's overall budget. Perhaps most troubling is the fact that this astonishing rise in incarceration and the escalating costs it has imposed on our country, in terms both economic and human, have not measurably benefited our society. I think we can all be proud of the progress that's been made at reducing the crime rate over the past 2 decades, thanks to the tireless work of prosecutors and the bravery of law enforcement officials across America. But statistics have shown, and all of us have seen, that high incarceration rates and longer than necessary prison terms have not played a significant role in materially improving public safety, reducing crime, or strengthening communities. In fact, the opposite is often true.
So I want you to keep in mind that his kind of pandering to law enforcement officials and how great they are is happening in the immediate shadow of the uprisings in Ferguson and elsewhere. So it's very much I think, a fairly overt political position that he's taking. Around the time of Holder's resignation, which happened in spring 2015, about a year ago, presidential, then I think at that point she had declared, presidential candidate Hillary Clinton called for a new era of criminal justice and police reform in a speech at the David Dinkins Leadership in Public Policy Forum at Columbia University. Candidate Clinton makes conspicuous use of the phrase era of mass incarceration in a speech that calls for the expanded use of police body cameras, in which further decries the fact that, quote, far too many people believe they are considered guilty simply because of the color of their skin, end quote. Clinton further elaborates.
Freddie, we have to come to terms with some hard truths about race and justice in America. There is something profoundly wrong when African American men are still far more likely to be stopped and searched by police, charged with crimes, and sentenced to longer prison terms than are meted out to their white counterparts. There is something wrong when a third of all black men face the prospect of prison during their lifetimes. And an estimated 1.5 million black men are, quote, missing from their families and communities because of incarceration and premature death. There is something wrong when more than 1 out of every 3 young black men in Baltimore cannot find a job. There is something wrong when trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve breaks down as far as it has in many of our communities. We have allowed our criminal justice system to get out of balance. And these recent tragedies should galvanize us to come together as a nation to find our balance again. We should begin by heeding the pleas of Freddie Gray's family for peace and unity, echoing the families of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and others in the past years. Those who are instigating further violence in Baltimore are disrespecting the Gray family and the entire community. They are compounding the tragedy of Freddie Gray's death and setting back the cause of justice. So the violence has to stop. But more broadly, let's remember that everyone in every community benefits when there is respect for the law and when everyone in every community is respected by the law. That is what we have to work towards in Baltimore and across our country. We must urgently begin to rebuild the bonds of trust and respect among Americans. Between police and citizens, yeah.
Sorry, I hate subjecting you to this. I really do. There's a couple more clips. You're gonna have to grit your teeth. I'm gonna refrain editorial statements until later. President Barack Obama's remarks, as my third example, during a July 2015 address to the NAACP in Philadelphia, echoes and amplifies candidate Clinton's message, with its seamless meshing of liberal criminal justice racial reform with a strident pro-police rhetoric of domestic peacekeeping. On the one hand, Obama speaks the language of reformist civil rights, anti-racism, when he stresses the need for a criminal justice regime that restores black and brown boys and men, and to a very secondary extent, girls and women, to positions of heteronormative racial respectability in civil society. It's here that it becomes possible to identify the liberal racial telos, the racial Bildungsroman, that structures in any lit majors or English majors. Okay, you know what I'm saying, right? The racial telos, the racial Bildungsroman, that structures an emergent state discourse and appropriation of the language mass incarceration, a term that Obama invokes explicitly and somewhat remarkably in this speech.
Among white men, that number is 1 in 214. The bottom line is that in too many places, black boys and black men, Latino boys and Latino men, experience being treated differently under the law. And I want to be clear, this is not just anecdote. This is not just barbershop talk. A growing body of research shows that people of color are more likely to be stopped, frisked, questioned, charged, detained. African Americans are more likely to be arrested. They are more likely to be sentenced to more time for the same crime. And one of the consequences of this is around 1 million fathers are behind bars. Around 1 in 9 African American kids has a parent in prison. What is that doing to our communities? What's that doing to those children? Our nation's being robbed of men and women who could be workers and taxpayers, could be more actively involved in their children's lives, could be role models, could be community leaders. And right now they're locked up for a non-violent offense. So our criminal justice system isn't as smart as it should be. It's not keeping us as safe as it should be. It is not as fair as it should be. Mass incarceration makes our country worse off, and we need to do something about it.
I know you're inspired. This is a lot to absorb, these 3 clips. I have one shorter one left, but when we consider especially how it is that the carceral racist state has now begun to assume the very languages that were recently directed toward radical and even abolitionist critiques of its own power. So there's clearly something lurking beneath the emerging state discourse, its appropriations of the language mass incarceration, that's worth, I think, some radical scrutiny. I would argue, in short, kind of crystallized terms, that what we are inhabiting in this particular historical moment is a statecraft of policing that skillfully links liberal reformist sympathy and the long historical fact of black people's subjection to state repression with adamant demands for a kinder, gentler, and expanded racial formation of law and order policing. What we're witnessing, in other words, is a vacillation, something that is resembling a working symbiosis between law and order policing and police body camera reform, a vacillation between stop and frisk, racial and gender state harassment, and liberal calls for so-called community policing. And of course, a vacillation between righteous outrage over individual homicidal police officers and simultaneous demands for more policing, sometimes issued by representatives of hyper-policed communities themselves. It's precisely this generalized re-narration of mass incarceration that facilitates rather than challenges or opposes the state-conducted and state-sanctioned cultural production of racist policing. And here I want to follow the lead, the methodology, and the analytical logic of the late sociologist Stuart Hall and his colleagues in their classic late 1970s study of the discursive, cultural, and social scientific components of racial policing in the book Policing the Crisis. Has anyone here read Policing the Crisis or aspects of it? I require all my grad students to read it, so one day I'll have you all read it too. After reading this book, Policing the Crisis, it's clear that the contemporary policing apparatus can only be adequately conceptualized as a simultaneity of institutional projects. It's at once a militarized bureaucratic apparatus that we're familiar with. It's a state and popular discursive and cultural regime. It's a far-ranging media and cultural production. And it's a dynamic state pedagogical project. Policing is all of the above. President Obama crystallizes the logic of this reformist statecraft of policing in an earlier part of the same speech, stating the following, and I promise this is the last clip I'm gonna subject you to.
Those violent, criminal, science also indicates that you get a point of diminishing returns. But it is important for us to recognize that violence in our communities is serious, and that historically, in fact, the African American community oftentimes was under-policed rather than over-policed. Folks were very interested in containing the African American community, so we're going to leave segregated areas, but within those areas, there wasn't enough police presence.
I know your senses have been numbed by hearing Holder and Clinton and Barack Obama twice, but I just want you to absorb the significance of what President Obama just said in that last sentence, where he makes this sweeping historical allegation that there haven't been enough cops in black areas. Just get your head around that if you can. Just struggle with that for a minute. So here's another crucial point that I wanted to draw out. While it's completely possible that the piecemeal measures to curb spectacular police violence might obtain widespread traction, I'd say that they have, the tactics and technologies of gendered racial criminalization, police occupation, and militarization that have been developed over the last 40 years remain the openly announced and generally presumed condition for both mass incarceration and its reform. In other words, it's completely likely that the technologies and institutional reach of policing will increase, expand, and intensify, even as the thing that we are calling mass incarceration is subjected to reformist scrutiny from within and beyond the racial state. Perhaps then, it's the moment in which the organic intellectuals and figureheads of the US state begin to use the allegedly critical language of mass incarceration that we must admit to ourselves that this term might have reached its point of explanatory and analytical obsolescence. That is, if it ever adequately explained and analyzed anything to begin with. I'd argue that the US racist state in its revamped post-racialist and multiculturalist form is both willing and capable of re-narrating the story of mass incarceration as a call for better, that is more tolerable and effectively racial consensus building technologies of criminalization, policing, and incarceration. This is why the historical present obtains a sense of urgency and emergency that's of a qualitatively different type. Certainly the rebellions against police violence across the US over the last couple years are forcing a partial disruption of classical white supremacist and anti-black policing strategies. You see this especially in places like Ferguson, which has had a persistently all-white police force, or almost all-white police force even up until now. Yet at the very same time, in response to this climate of protest and uprising, the state building of racial policing reform is premised on a strengthening and relegitimation of police authority and prestige. You hear this in the rhetorics of all three of these state figures, right? They constantly speak the language of police prestige, what you owe to police, what you owe to the representatives of law enforcement, and so on ad nauseum. At the very same time, what you also see is that the state and its vast pedagogical extensions, from the nonprofit industrial complex and policy think tanks to the corporate media and the elementary schools, are re-amplifying their cultural, material, and political investments in the form of policing state power that relies on the constant winning of hearts and minds, culminating in the production of a climate of consent among both the racially criminalized and those presumed innocent. Who then exactly is this mass and mass incarceration? If it is not the case, really not even remotely astronomically the case, that Euro-descended people and those racially marked white are being criminalized, policed, and incarcerated in mass, that is, if the concept and common sense apprehension of the term mass incarceration already presumes casual and official white innocence, and if it also takes for granted the assumption of white bodily entitlement to physiological integrity and civil mobility, then is mass incarceration an honest or even generally useful term to describe this particular regime of policing and criminalization? As the phrase mass incarceration is absorbed into the operative language of the state, an absorption that's undoubtedly a complex outcome of academic, public policy, and strategic governmental interactions, does it not become necessary to consider how this rhetoric is becoming more of an accomplice to the racist state than an effective language of opposition to it? Here then is a principal point of radical political and cultural struggle. What might it take to incite political cultural liberation from the languages and narratives of a self-reforming liberal racist state in this complex moment of racial formation? This is part 2. And this is how it always seems to end, with another version of the same global racial narrative inauguration. Words, phrases, concepts are emptied into an opening allegation of suffocating universality, a lie that speaks of a common subjection to suffering, in our case of a mass that in its very imagination rescripts and amplifies the logics of intimate and global white supremacist life orderings. It is the unshakable force of this narrative that drives some of us toward obsessive opposition to liberal multiculturalist common sense, one that's no less vile and violent despite its diverse embodiments, whether in Obama, Holden, Clinton, or otherwise. All the while, some of us wonder, or better, we fantasize and fictionalize in our constant imagination and experimentation of revolt, whether escape is even possible, if the terms of revolution or abolition are adequate to the historical task of our moment. For there's little doubt that it is a rigorously culturally produced, distended end of days that's arrived in the briefcases and badges of people like Goldwater, Reagan, Bill Clinton, Holder, Obama, Hillary Clinton, Rudolph Giuliani, Daryl Gates, Joe Arpaio, and all their cohorts and accomplices. Against the force of these languages and narratives, some of us have begun to use and have been using other terms, even as far too many people actually inhabit the reality of these terms. Terms like annihilation, apocalypse, genocide, domestic warfare. Beneath, around, and actively overwhelming the sterile and increasingly state-sanctioned phrase mass incarceration, there is institutionalized misery, radical and conspiratorial geniuses might also be able to be traced across friends and colleagues like Fred Moten, Jacques Costa Vargas, Clyde Woods, Joy James, Dan Berger, and others. People who have begun to trace institutionalized misery, the collective anticipation of everyday racist state aggression through the fugitive and plantation liberation praxis of the enslaved. People who walk alongside the historically colonized and occupied peoples around the planet, who have figured out how to survive and periodically disrupt or even overthrow their own involuntarily inherited forms of occupation policing and spatial incarceration. Many are shy to embrace those languages, perhaps because they suggest a departure from compulsory respect for the law and its armed executioners. What does it also mean, then, for the circulation of the term mass incarceration to become the sanctioning rhetoric of an enhanced, reformed, expanded policing regime? How ludicrous might it have been for 19th century white abolitionists to claim that the chattel institution was also mass slavery rather than what it was, a racial, colonial, genocidal, and proto-genocidal project? This is what it means to sit on the other side of a present tense, liberal, progressive common sense that seems inseparable from the white supremacist origins and logics of the modern humanist project. There's a possibility, at the very least, to remain uncompromising in our praxis and theorization of radical terms. I'm saying this is the least we can do, is to at least use the right languages, right? There's a lot of, there's a dense culture of disempowerment that suffocates us all the time, but one thing that we still have some autonomy over is the language we use. And I would argue that's really fundamental. right? That's not a minimal practice. That's fundamental to politics. That's fundamental to meaning. That's fundamental to culture, fundamental to how you see the world. So I'm insisting that we take radical hold of that autonomy over language. These radical terms, which I think also translate into all forms of radical transformative praxis, research, scholarship, and so forth. I argue that this is the dense reality of what some of us have begun to call abolition in the climate of 21st century gendered racist state violence within and beyond the United States. At times, instruction and example to provoke and nourish these kinds of desires, these practices, these languages of radical insurgency actually come to the surface, and they shatter the worst cynicism and disrupt the sense of paralysis that these ongoing histories of racist state violence enforce as their selective burden on particular people. The emergence over the last 3 or so years of the Chicago-based Black and Brown-led multi-generational grassroots group, We Charge Genocide, has furnished exemplary leadership on multiple fronts and is engaged in precisely the kind of scholarly, cultural, and discursive work that can displace the liberal progressive narratives of police reform and mass incarceration. In a recently published open letter to the ACLU that incinerates it for its sellout settlement with the Chicago Police Department on the matter of Chicago Police Department stop and frisk policies, we can begin to embrace how it is that We Charge Genocide offers another kind of historical narrative, another kind of language that belies the updated law and order rhetorics of the racial and racist state. Challenging the American Civil Liberties Union's bypassing of Chicago's radical black leadership and grassroots black leadership in negotiating the settlement with the Chicago PD, and further exploding the ACLU's compartmentalized notion of stop and frisk policing as a relatively isolated discriminatory police practice. We Charge Genocide asserts, and I'm quoting from the document, from their letter here, quote, "We understand police violence to be rooted in historical and systemic anti-blackness that seeks to control, contain, and repress black bodies through acts of repeated violence. Stop and frisk should be understood as a tool police use to punish black people just for being. Police violence is always state-sanctioned violence, and further strengthening narrow supervision of police action by elites will never address that. This is why any legislative or law-based campaign to address police violence requires not just policy change, but an actual transformation of power relations between communities of color and the police," end quote. I could read the whole letter to you. By the way, this is all online, right? WeChargeGenocide.org. Check it out. It may be worth considering Chicago's We Charge Genocide as one among other sites of creative narrative genius, that both, and collective genius, right? I'm trying to use an anti-elitist notion of the term genius. I'm talking about the creative genius that comes out when people sit in a room together and try to think and work radically. It's one of the examples of creative narrative genius that both disrupts and transforms hegemonic frameworks, languages of police brutality, spectacular but isolated racist state violence, and, for that matter, mass incarceration. The very existence of this particular Chicago-based organization suggests that the political legibility and ethical traction of the term genocide might remain one particularly useful leverage point for movements and collectivities struggling to win ground in their movements against various forms of racial and racial colonial oppression. The classic 1951 accusation of anti-black genocide lodged against the U.S. government in the We Charge Genocide petition right there on the left. This is obviously the document, the famous text from which the Chicago organization has borrowed its name, as well as the 2007 UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Obviously, it's right there on the right. These two documents, among many others, exemplify the possibilities of that kind of strategic work, that is the use of the concept and term genocide. Genocide, when repurposed as a tactical description of racial and racial colonial terror, has I would argue, a somewhat unique way of tearing apart the edifices of liberal progressive pretense that tend to suggest the possibility of rigorous state and societal reform as the difficult though achievable solution to a social order structured in racial dominance. So I want to conclude by briefly paying focused attention to how a group like We Charge Genocide narrates and theorizes the living apocalypse of targeted geographies, physiologies, and bodies in a manner that demystifies what I've called the statecraft of racial policing and its ostensible reform of mass incarceration. In this case, the grounds of radical insurgency and praxis are global in their reach. The organizers and radical intellectuals of We Charge Genocide contextualize Chicago's own normalized racist policing regime as an indexing of the fact of state-produced gendered racial evisceration as a general modality of power, no less central to contemporary configurations of life, suffering, and fatality than other key terms like empire, war, neoliberalism, and occupation. We Charge Genocide's most prominent action to date was their September 2014 report to the UN Committee Against Torture, that's the United Nations Committee Against Torture, which was followed 2 months later by extended testimony in Switzerland from several members and organizers of We Charge Genocide. The narrative of this report, again available online, posits an acute rebuttal of individualized and compartmentalized notions of police brutality. By the way, that's why I oppose that rhetoric in large part, because the things that we often name as police brutality are actually not police brutality, they're just policing. Right? The language police brutality implies illegality, implies police have broken policy, but I would argue the vast majority of the things, the actions that we name as police brutality end up actually being sanctioned by the state, which means they're not really brutality. That's just police MO. It's just policing. I think when we change that language, that our thinking changes too, our politics change. So the narrative of this particular report instead enacts a rhetoric of the systemic that echoes a genealogy of black radicalism as well as revolutionary, anti-colonial, anti-apartheid, and other abolitionist practices. Deploying the category of police violence throughout the 15-page report. For example, it has sections that are titled the following way: Chicago police violence, harassment and abuse. Chicago police violence, use of deadly force. Chicago police violence, sexual assaults, and so forth and so on, right? They almost never use the phrase police brutality. In addition to this, they infuse their document, the report back, with testimonials from Black and Latina youth. And in all of this, We Charge Genocide mounts a stunningly lucid rejoinder to the ideas of the white disciplinary society and the state of exception, as well as liberal progressive desires for police accountability. I should also say that We Charge Genocide supports efforts for police reform and accountability. At the very same time, it qualifies that support by saying that its mission is to end police violence, that's their terms, and not just to demand justice for incidents of excessive and ostensibly criminal police brutality. Obviously, the organization firmly aligns itself with a particular historical stream of black radicalism. By citing the title of the 1951 UN petition filed by the Black Communist-led Civil Rights Congress as its political guidance and inspiration, the group signifies an early 21st century genocide accusation that hemorrhages any residual notions of Chicago as a thriving post-Obama presidency, post-racial city. As this black and brown insurgency against the policing force of the racist state is animated by a black radical genealogy, it patterns its organizational practices within a sober, grounded analysis of a surrounding climate of intensive, systemic, numbingly normal racist terror, invasiveness, and physiological vulnerability. Perhaps then, a central part of the contemporary radical and abolitionist challenge is to consider how other languages, rhetorics, and concepts, including and beyond the terms of genocide, live and move on the underside and disavowed edges of the dominant discourses around so-called mass incarceration. What productive and creative work, for example, does this particular mobilization of the terms of genocide do for anti-racist, liberation-oriented radical insurgencies against the modern socio-juridical order? The significance of the mobilization of the language and accusation of genocide in these and other geographies and moments of racial and racial colonial power and state violence does not necessarily lie in the legal feasibility or the actual or potential accusation and charge. Nor does its significance lie in the term's incomplete capacity to bring totalizing legibility to the suffering and casualties of particular racialized human populations. Rather, I would argue that moments like the ones I just offered you should be interpreted as moments of artistry and creativity, where genocide becomes a different kind of keyword. It becomes a keyword in a morbid and weaponized poetry of insurrection, an eruptive announcement of emergency within a state of normalcy, that in fact echoes the well-known, in most quarters anyways, in most quarters of legal study. Legal scholar Raphael Lemkin, he's the one that's credited with coining the term genocide. who makes the paradigmatic definition of genocide, in his words, as, quote, a problem not only of war but also of peace. Probably, to me, one of the most important lines from his 800-page book, to say that genocide is a problem not only of war but also of peace. To consider this poetry in its fullest artistry is to grasp other epistemic, ontological, collective, physiological positions, to consider how the genocide charge, the accusation, as an affirmation of a shared coursing of shed blood and resistant life. How this is also confirmation of racial power in its most far-reaching and de-individualized forms. When genocide becomes the chosen language for those inhabiting the historical edges of racialization through the racist carceral chattel settler state, there's a laceration of the social flesh that coheres normalized, institutionalized dehumanization. At times, such articulations, such charges and accusations can be made without ever using the term genocide itself. And it's in such moments that critical interpretation and the re-narration of these stories create a potentially radical practice of the most immediate kind. Thank you. So you have time for discussion, right?
I have a question. So I'm wondering if you have an analysis of different concerned groups about mass incarceration, police brutality, etc., that come from more non-white communities, so average people who are trying to speak out about the issue, but conform to the standard language.
I think that that's generally what does happen. And it's a couple things. One is, let me be critical about it first, right? One reason why a lot of targeted communities end up using the dominant language is because there's been a kind of gutting of infrastructures of theorization within those communities, right? And the way that gutting happens is obviously through the way that schools have been completely just fucked up, right? And all these, so there's that's obvious. And there's a larger, I think, intensive toxification of the national political culture that discourages analysis. It discourages, people call it critical thinking, it discourages theoretical thinking. Because theoretical thinking is inherently critical thinking. Don't get it twisted, right? That's inherently what that is. It discourages, and so what people call it a dumbing down, but it's actually worse than that, right? Because dumbing down means that you can just get smart, but I think it's worse than a dumbing down. It's actually a kind of pathology of critique, a pathology of theoretical work that's enforced by policing too. So when you look at the last 50 years and see how it is that the infrastructures of theorization that for many, many years spurred new languages of radicalism in targeted communities were intensively targeted by the U.S. racist state for elimination, and then for co-optation as well. I'm talking about the various forms of organization that happen in ghettos, barrios, in prisons and jails, in asylums, everywhere, right? That the U.S. racist state made it an intensive, multi-dimensional program to get rid and dissipate those forms of grassroots organization, radical grassroots organization. At the same time that it incarcerated and killed people, it created this thing called the nonprofit industrial complex, which took the most college-educated and respectable ones, right, and the ones who were most inclined to be liberals, and brought them into empowerment through the nonprofit structure, right? So what you have in the end is a kind of conscious, programmatic, systemic destruction of a radical, grassroots, intellectual, and theoretical infrastructure that would otherwise allow for creative genius to flourish against the bullshit of phrases like mass incarceration and police brutality, right? So there's that as the context. Now, what takes place then is that folks will use the language but mean something else by it, right? In some instances, you see like the dude in this early slide I showed you where there's the black elder right there who actually modifies the phrase pretty explicitly. But what you see more often is folks don't necessarily modify the phrase. They don't call it mass black incarceration, but that's what they mean, right? The problem is that when that phrase comes to mean all kinds of different things, it becomes meaningless, right? Now, at the same time that that's going on, where I get probably 90% of the analysis I just gave you in dense theoretical terms comes from people who 20 years ago now, God, man, I'm getting old, it's 20, yeah, around late 90s, 90, 60, 98, 99, right around that time, people who were shifting the language that I used around the rise of the prison industrial complex to using the terms of genocide. And that's because people would talk about it in those terms. I'm talking about elders from those communities would come to meetings with attorneys, with academics, with other grassroots activists, with nonprofit organizers and whatnot, and they would insist on using different kinds of terms. So they would say, yeah, I'm here because the prison industrial complex is genocide against my, you know what I mean? They would make that link. So that goes on all the time as well. So the problem, I think, it's not a problem. The challenge is how to take those languages seriously and to circulate them in places beyond those kind of privatized conversations, right? So what would it mean to take my friend Dorsey Nunn's language of genocide in East Palo Alto seriously, right? To take it as a point of theoretical departure, as an analytical framework. And of course, he's not the only one. There's a lot of people who have been using this language literally for decades at this point around this. But that's part of that autonomy around language that I think needs to be exercised as a central part of radicalism, of abolitionism, whatever you want to call it.
Thanks.
We can talk a lot more about that. Yes?
I have a question regarding, so this use of language of maybe sort of using genocide as a replacement for incarceration. I was just kind of thinking about, it still sort of implies to me this like ending or this like complete silencing when
Yeah.
I think of like inmate labor as like, it's like there's still many things in like is the New York State like police, the New York police like inmates are like manufacturing items that are then being used outside in like the free world.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering if there's a way to sort of align that with this idea of like genocide is that these people are gone, they're ended, but like there is still like a problem where like their like slave labor is like existing in the real world, and I'm just wondering how to line those.
So my short answer to your question is that they don't line up. And here's why. I understand that one of the main ways that criticisms, progressive criticisms of the contemporary incarceration regime get hold of people is to talk about the use of slave labor in prisons. Okay, the dirty little secret within progressive and liberal circles is that the use of prison labor to manufacture consumer products is so small, right? The number of people who are incarcerated on those conditions is so small that it's almost negligible. And what that then means, on the other hand, is that not that shit is better, it's actually worse. What it means is that the logic of incarceration is, to put it politely, it's enforced idleness, right? Which is a euphemism for what you might think about as social and civil death, right? So, I don't know, how many of y'all know somebody that's incarcerated or has been? Doesn't have to be a family member, it could be somebody you know, right? If you talk to that person, they'll tell you that getting a job when you're in prison is actually a privilege, right? And it's not just because it gets you out of enforced idleness. In many places, in many states, it actually gets you days off of your sentence, right? So every day that you spend manufacturing a license plate or whatever you're doing, actually earns you points in the parole board hearing so that they'll reduce your sentence. So it's weird that becoming, chattel labor is actually beneficial to getting you decarcerated. So there's that. Now, what that means is that the analysis actually has to change, right? And that's why I would argue the term genocide is used in this poetic way, because what it speaks to is the notion of people being just socially liquidated, right? It kind of brings some sense of disruption, even to the progressive and liberal insistence that the main reason to criticize prisons is because of prison slave labor, right? It says the response is no, it's not, right? Like my cousin, uncle, mom, whatever, right? They're incarcerated, they don't get to work, right? Shit, they want a job, right? They're just eliminated, and we can't visit them because they're all the way over there, and we work 60 hours a week, and I'm in school, and we can't get on a bus, and we can't drive, can't afford the gas, whatever, so they're just gone from our lives. We talk to them on the phone once a month, right? Because that costs $2 a minute. And so I think that when you hear the term genocide coming up, it might still now let me back off my kind of dichotomy a little bit. Sometimes people will still use the term genocide and invoke prison slave labor, but I'm saying that in terms of an actual institutional analysis, in the US context anyways, prison slave labor is not really a significant logic of incarceration. In terms of producing the kind of consumer products. I mean, I got brought into this briefly in the latter 90s before I realized that it was like almost nobody was doing it. I mean, because there was a brief moment where, I remember the national news, like, I think it was Nightline or 2020, did a report on how, I think it was Avis, one of these rent-a-car companies was using incarcerated people to operate some of their customer service hotlines and stuff. That stuff came, that media attention brought that stuff to an end really quick. And why? Because they'd rather go hire my cousin in Manila, right, who speaks English with minimal or no accent, right, to work for their bullshit operation. I mean, one cousin works for Microsoft in Manila doing online customer service. Another one's working, I think, for Sprint, right? And they can exploit their labor almost as cheaply and with no political consequences. Right? There's no humanitarian civil rights outcry that you're using slave labor. You're just using third world brown labor. Right? And that's perfectly acceptable in the neoliberal world of capitalist imperial America. So what I'm saying then is that when we think about how these languages emerge, sometimes the reason they emerge is because these other languages that progressives and liberals put out there actually doesn't make sense to them. Right? When the vast majority of people who inhabit this condition say, the folks that we have that are locked up, they don't manufacture anything for Victoria's Secret or Pizza Hut.
Yeah.
You follow what I'm saying?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just, trying to think of the idea of realizing these people aren't dead, that they're living, and that they're. So I was just thinking, there's a show in New York where an artist purchased through the company that sells these items, a bunch of items produced by prisoners, including like the desks that the New York state lawmakers used to sign ballots or sign bills on, preventing minimum wage increases for prison labor, were manufactured by these prisoners. And I just think the visibility of their living people producing these things is something that I can see getting lost in the language of genocide.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point, and that's an important point. And that's why what's important to me about the particular poetry of this organization is that they don't sit at the level of mourning death. They're talking about inhabiting a condition. There's a difference, right? That's why even in the way they name themselves, we charge genocide, as opposed to, our folks are dead from genocide or whatever, right? That's a key difference. And I would argue that this is nothing new either, right? That all the populations, all the peoples on the planet that have been involuntarily subjected to what we might think about as some version of genocidal violence, right, have never simply just resigned and accepted those conditions. That there's always an active way that people inhabit that position, that condition, and try to survive it, of course, but also come up with ways to insurrect against it, to leave marks on the historical record beyond their biological life. And so there's all different complicated ways and nuanced and creative and ingenious ways that people inhabit that position. So I'm with you on that. Yeah, I think that's another way that we have to be very specific and intimate with how it is that people use these languages. Yeah. Now, one more thing. That's not to say that there's not also important political moments where it's crucial for people to do the work of mourning, right? That sometimes, how part of what this is doing is to make an accusation. I'm saying sometimes, my friend Fred Moten says that. He says, when we were talking about this, he said sometimes there's just power in making the accusation, right? So sometimes there's moments like that too, to say you can't bring back our dead. You know what I mean? Or even if they're biologically living, it's another way to state that. And a lot of people who've been incarcerated for a period of time, a significant period of time especially, will say this. They'll say, I'm never the same. right? I'll never be the same because of what this particular institution did to me. Like I can't just decolonize myself from it, right? It kind of sits with me. Just like you all will never be the same from being in a different kind of free world set of carceral institutions, right? There's a way you get institutionalized. Some forms are more brutal than others. Yes.
I heard in your talk a lot of like one of the points we picked up on was that the liberal language and radical language is being co-opted and to really build up the prison state. And what I heard you gesture towards was language especially being used. But I'm wondering if you have any more any more of an agent other than language, or are you really focusing on language as the agent?
I don't have a prescription for how to organize, if that's what you mean. But what I do.
Well, I'm specifically thinking of Mary Marcawa's the first civil right, where she specifically indicts liberals and liberal reforms for building up the prison state or the carceral state rather. Right.
Sorry, I'm not sure how to answer your question. I'm not sure what your question actually is.
I guess I'm just wondering I hear a lot of indictment of language.
Yeah.
That's really what you want us to take away from this to just really.
Well, in one sense, I would really be grateful to everyone in the room if, number one, you don't use the phrase mass incarceration anymore and decide what phrase you do want to use. I have phrases I prefer depending on the situation. Sometimes I'll use the phrase domestic war. Sometimes I'll use the phrase anti-black, anti-brown, state violence. Sometimes whatever, right? But I think if we're able to do that, that's I am kind of in the immediate sense. I think that the phrase mass incarceration is actually dangerous, right? That the kind of cultural and imaginative work that it does fucks everything up, right? It turns the clock backwards on any traction that the political work that many people have been trying to do for the last 20 years, to the point where now you can actually say you're an abolitionist. In the early 2000s, people would think you were a freak, in the worst pathologized political sense of that term, freak, right? They would ignore you, they'd run you out the room if you said, I'm an abolitionist, right? They'd be like, what are you, you know what I mean? Now people say that, but I've also begun to wonder whether they're really abolitionists, right? Or if it's a term that just has traction, and so it's a way to distinguish themselves from somebody else. So there is that, right? On the other hand, what I would also say, it's not just enough to stop using the phrase. You also have to do what I'm trying to do here, I think, in some other way, which is to challenge other people's uses of it, including your professors, including other activists and whatever, right? So I gave a much shorter version of this conversation in I think it was November at a conference, right, with two other co-panelists, both of whom are identify the Black radical tradition. One of whom was using the phrase mass incarceration. He went after me. So I did this whole polemic against mass incarceration, and this guy's a friend of mine named Toussaint. He's in Chicago, but he started. He's like, man. He said he was taking notes, and he said it's too late. But now I realized that if I'd heard the critique before, I would have done a find and replace in my Word document for the phrase mass incarceration. It said something else. But it was in good humor, but it was nonetheless important that he made note of that fact. He said that it fucked up his language. Right, and it kind of forced a reflection on how that's become the catch-all for something that might actually not be signified by that phrase. So on the one hand, it's I think important to not use the phrase, and on the other hand, it's important to challenge people who do. And I'll echo what the late great Fred Hampton said many times, which is that once you, and Malcolm X and others, right, Audre Lorde, all kinds of people say this, that once you change your language, your entire pattern of thought organizing, analysis, everything changes around that. So, in that sense, I think I would honor what it is that people are already doing, right? To try to inhabit this particular historical moment of ours in some critical, radical, insurgent way, but also say that the way we inhabit that also needs to change, and be very suspicious of when the Holders, Clintons, and Obamas of the world start to use that language that we were using last week, right? Usually it's at that time that it's time to toss that language out, right? And to cuss those people out for using it. Kind of like in the how dare you sense. It's like, how dare, you know what I mean? Because I actually think it's outrageous for all three of these figures to be doing this kind of reformist spiel, which is as old as prisons itself around mass incarceration, at the same time that they're honoring law enforcement and mystifying law enforcement in the immediate shadow of uprisings all over the United States over multi-generational grievances against policing. I mean,
Political pandering.
yeah, yeah. Anything else? Anyone else want to? Questions, clarification? Yes.
I guess I'm curious, you were talking about like the uptake of kind of like the language, like radical language and like, into like liberal kind of like reform. Is the thought that like by making the language like so distinct and like genocide, like you can't separate that from like the fact of like what is happening, that like if this language even is kind of like taken up by like public political figures, that it like won't be able to like obscure like what is happening?
That's there's never a guarantee,
Yeah.
right? And that's why I don't think any language is ironclad. Just like I thought the word, if you had asked me 10 years ago about the word abolitionist, I might have thought that.
Mm-hmm.
I might have thought, well, shit, there's nothing you can do with that term that could water it down. I was wrong, right? Because I hear people using the term abolitionist now who are very much not abolitionists. They'll use the word abolitionist at the very same time that they're cautioning the rest of us against being too oppositional to police force, right? So there's no such thing as a language that can be insulated from that. That's why in the time I've been thinking about this critique, I realize that it's really not about that, right? In other words, the point of the politics, the point of the creativity is not to try to create some kind of ironclad language that can't be co-opted. It's to respect the fact that people they're speaking poetry, right? And poetry changes literally from one moment to the next, right? The gestures you use, the language you use, the inflections you give to words like mass incarceration, like genocide, even like rights, right? As you just brought up. The way that you mobilize and inflect those terms can produce poetries that exceed the definitional textbook, legal, or other, formal definitions and concepts that are therein. That's how it is that I think groups like We Charge Genocide are using the term genocide. They don't give a shit about the United Nations. They really don't. I would argue that the Civil Rights Congress, when they filed this petition, they had no expectation whatsoever that the United Nations would actually move on the petition. That wasn't the point. If you ever look at this document, it is a document that is a morbid 160, 170 page piece of poetry, right? That's what it is. It is like a poetry written in the language of a certain historicized black radicalism that could give a shit what the UN thinks, right? And that's not the point of it. The point is to lodge the charge. That makes sense.
I would say you can't count out the state to use that language considering the
Absolutely.
language of slavery.
Absolutely.
The word in the 13th Amendment.
Yeah, I mean, the next thing you'll get is the state apologizing for genocide, right? I mean, Bill Clinton apologized for slavery, right? I mean, there's nothing that would stop that. And we also see that the right wing, meaning the responsible right and then the far right, they use these languages all the time, right? Like the much of the white populist support for the Trump candidacy is animated by notions of anti-white genocide, by way of miscegenation, affirmative action, etc. Right? So there's no way you can use. I mean, Hillary Clinton used the phrase premature death, right, in her speech, which for a number of years, in large part thanks to Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of the phrase racism, people have been using that term more and more, and it's Ruthie's rearticulation of a term that comes from anthropology, premature death, right? And not just anthropology, but other sciences as well. So now it's Hillary Clinton's phrase, right? She took it on and said, yeah, this is something that's horrible. All these black people dying prematurely, it's horrible. Right? So there's absolutely nothing that is outside the scope of the racial racist state to kind of appropriate and turn into something else.
You were talking earlier about continuity. I forget in what specific context, but looking back to the origin of the term mass incarceration, then also looking back to the evolution of genocide and persecution of Black people from slavery up until now. I'm wondering if you've noticed any regional differences in the way that anti-Black violence and anti-brown violence gets manifested in the country. So South versus North versus West.
Oh yeah, I mean it's regional. It's by neighborhood sometimes. You know what I mean? Like you're talking about the techniques through the structures, the systems.
Yeah, techniques because, and then also if you think about the term mass incarceration, since it's used a lot by more liberal circles, I wouldn't expect it to pop up more in like the conservative South, or I expect them to be using it in a way that was significantly different from how it's used.
I didn't bother to talk about this because I didn't want to waste any time on it in the precious time I have with you all. But conservatives are actually using the language of mass incarceration pretty robustly now also. And of course their language is, and they're opposed to it, right? Of course the reason they're opposed to it, I mean they give some lip service to the idea that, oh yeah, it's the racial disparity is really horrible. America's not about, they'll do that. But their language around fiscal responsibility, in a lot of ways, they'll say it's war on drugs was a failure because it wasted all this money. And there's still crime on the street. And they'll say, oh, we're over incarcerating people, and really those people should be put into, this or that kind of thing to be productive. So there's a kind of overlap in terms of thinking how it is that the right wing has come to support the language of reform for mass incarceration, in addition to the fact that we need to take seriously how it is that even beneath all those national discourses that the Holders, the Clintons, the Obamas, and the others of the world will articulate, there's geographic specificity to how it is that these logics of anti-Black and anti-brown state violence take hold. I mean, all you have to do is go to New Orleans to see how that works, right? Then you take a short trip to to Biloxi, right, and then hop on a plane and go to Miami and then to New York City, and you'll see like. It's specificity with continuity. That's what I'll say, right? Like the specificity is important. You need to look at how Portland works, right, and understand how's gentrification and policing working in Portland. What lessons can you learn from other cities that have been doing work around policing and gentrification, like say San Francisco, right? Look at how San Francisco gentrification is working. So what is similar? What's different? Like what techniques do police and the stakeholders in gentrification use to try to facilitate their projects in those places? And because here's the thing, the organic intellectuals of gentrification and policing, you can be absolutely assured they talk to each other all the time, right? They talk to each other all the time. There's a reason why it is that, y'all heard of Corrections Corporation of America, CCA? It's a famous private prison company in the United States. They couldn't get a stranglehold on the prison industrial complex in the US because there's a lot of kind of liberal outcry against the abuses in private prisons. So what CCA do, they became a global neoliberal corporation, and now they build prisons in South Africa, in the UK, and all over the world. They become a global organization, corporation, just like Microsoft, right? Now what's interesting about that, what's important about that is when you look at the people who run CCA, they're in conversation with other administrators of prisons and criminal justice all over the planet, right? Same with police, William Bratton. As one particularly prominent example, he's known for being police chief in these different cities for bringing a law and order kind of racist policing apparatus to these different places, and he circulates. He's an organic intellectual of the police state, of the racist police state. So that's what I'm saying when I say that it's specificity with continuity. The continuity comes from the fact that the people who organize these systems are in constant conversation with each other. They're constantly innovating. And so you need to do that too, right? We need to do that too.
I see.
So if there's nothing else, we call it quits, Meredith? What do you think? Yeah. All right. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
thank you for this very you mentioned that you would be willing to send out the artists, and I'm interested in
Great. Do you,
taking a look at it.
if you email me,
Uh-huh.
I'll send you. I can send you a copy. I can send you a syllabus of the class that I've been teaching. I'll send you the most. I'm teaching it again in the fall, so it'll change. But I'll send you the most recent version of that syllabus.
Okay.
But you can reach me.
Perfect.
I'll send you. All right.
That was my question.
Oh, okay.
I was just say thanks, man. Thanks for
Hey, I was just emailing him today.
Oh really? I actually just got his book.
Oh, you gotta read his book.
Yeah, I just like started. Well, it's really funny too. So I go to law school at UC Clark.
Okay.
And I'm actually in this reading group where we're reading Pro, and I have to like teach part of the reading tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm gonna go listen to Rodríguez talk and
Okay.
figure this out, right?
Okay.
Yeah, but it's just really fucking funny. Like, also, like a friend of mine is like just starting to teach at UCR. I think.
Who's that?
Eric Stanley.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I just emailed with him yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, there's like such
No,
like.
he was trying to get together this week, but I'm like, I'm in Portland. I can hook up to him next week.
Yeah, there's all kinds of cool stuff happening. He was just like interviewing up there. He's like producing clubs. Yeah, and then they're just like anyway. I just wanted to say thanks.
Hey, pleasure. Small world. In a good way this time.
Yeah, totally. I'm gonna email you too for your syllabus.
Please do. Please
All
do.
right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take these.
All that like genocide. Do you feel like there's a limit to that and like securists making it too expensive for families in communication with the family? And of course, California passing out with regulations where you can only communicate on a business card. So I was kind of thinking about that when you were talking. It's like it kind of perpetuates that.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing: is that it sets up all these kind of structures of social and familial alienation. So when somebody gets incarcerated in most states, especially places like California, they get cut off from their affective ties to their loved ones and friends, not just family, but like whatever community people are there. Even if it's whether it's a gang or whether it's their immediate family, their children, or whatever it is. And so then everything kind of lines up behind it, including the phone calls and everything, including the choice on where is that prison. And that's not a coincidence. That's a convergence of kind of post-industrial neoliberal geographies of prison to take advantage of the emptying out of farmland and its repurposing it to become parcel. Part of the parcel. And so it's partly that Rodríguez written a lot, obviously, was the main expert. But in addition to that, there's the kind of strategic and conspiratorial and large scale sense of conspiracy, the conspiratorial logics of the state that has learned from the flourishing of prison organizing in jail, prison and jail organizing and uprising for most of the 70s into the early 80s, that one of the best ways to facilitate insurgency within not only prisons, but in oppressed and policed communities is to allow for those dialogues between incarcerated people and their loved ones to take place. Right, so Attica, San Quentin is right near San Francisco, right? It's right near Oakland. Like people used to go there and they'd be able to visit people when the Panthers were being incarcerated. Like at the very least, the geographic proximity of San Quentin meant that you could hold rallies right there, and people would have support, and so it means a lot to people that are incarcerated, that people are nearby and see it, at least even if the state won't let them, they know that they're there, just out, right? So it means everything. The state learns from this. So one of the I think strategic consequences of the geographies of incarceration is also this long-term strategy of simultaneous political action by way of displacing and law, and then rapidly disrupting the possibility, any possibility of political organizing and conversation and education happening in prisons and jails, right? So there's that. At the very same time that there's the kind of programmatic systemic affective ties as well. So it all ends up being relatively symbiotic, right? Now, at the same time I'm saying that, one thing that you notice in places where it's been like this for a while is that folks end up generating new, not new, I should say resistant forms of community, I guess, resistant forms of family and love and this kind of thing in the face of all this. So I remember when my son's godfather, who I befriended with, I became good friends with him. He was in St. Quentin, and he's out now, But the times when I would visit him at Soledad, which is, it's been around for a long time, Soledad, but it's far away. It's like 3 or 4 hours from the Bay Area. I go visit him, and I visit maybe twice a year, because at this point I was working at UCR Riverside. I visit him twice a year, but what I noticed is that every time I would visit him, I'd see the same people. Right? And so it's interesting, and these people were working class people, a lot more poor people, and they ended up forming a kind of a fairly regular community of visitors that was identified by the fact that they all had RVs from the 1970s. They'd get in their RVs, they'd park on the side of Highway 101, they sleep in a overnight and be there at the gate at 4:30 when it open up, right? So at the same time, they all discuss it never really works. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
So like it works, but it doesn't. It works, but it doesn't work. So that kind of gets at that question of that was raised around the implication of a certain usage of the term genocide can suggest that it's over already. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing you can do, everybody's fucking dead. In contrast with the way people really use it, which is say that we're living in it, and this is how we're working and rebelling and living against it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and I try to keep in touch with my clients. For that reason.
Yeah.
I know how these
Yeah.
$45
So you know probably better than I do how this works. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I always try to at least send 2 or 3 courses a year.
Yeah.
When you said that, my clients are usually
Yeah.
I had one client told me that I had all these opportunities to get out.
Yeah.
I was a football player, I had scholarships to go to discuss. But it was my family sport. My mom could not bring me further on the way to grad school because we had 6 other kids. So everyone always says, oh, you had all these opportunities, but they're not real opportunities.
Yeah.
So, and same family in that same community who has no resources. Now their son's in prison for 12 years, and there's just no ability for, we have technology like telephone, but there's no access to it.
Right.
And, there's email, but there's no access to that. There's so much, it's not prohibited.
Yeah.
And it's another also example of the industrial complex.
Yeah.
The industrial complex, people profiting off of people in imprisonment, whereas it seems like the state should have an interest in creating relationships and fostering. That's not what happens.
You would think.
That's not what
No,
happens.
absolutely. Exactly.
And it's the same thing when I'm trying to get judges before my clients to be housed in the community which they lived in. And they said, well, I'm not going to tell you what to do.
Right.
They want to throw them up in NorCal.
Right.
It's their business.
Exactly. So you're in it every day.
You're doing the work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me
Yeah.
talk to you.
Yeah, appreciate it. I'll tell, what's your name again?
It's Michael.
Michael, I'll tell Eric. I'm supposed to see Eric in the next week.
Yeah.
So we're gonna sit down and have lunch. So I'll tell myself Michael.
Yeah. It's funny because I saw Dean Spade speak here.
Yeah.
Dean's speaking in a couple weeks. I don't want to let you talk to other people, but yeah, I'll email you.
I was gonna ask about Eric Stanley anyway.
I gotta go study anyway.
You're still in law school, right?
Yeah, I know, and that's the other thing, right? Like the law, I have to come to things like this to stay good.
Stay sane, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you. Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Claire. I was just wondering if this recording was going to be made
Sorry?
available.
I have no idea. I'm assuming, I signed a waiver or like a release for it, so I'm assuming it'll be out there something. Meredith.
What?
Yeah.
Thank you. And then also, I heard you overheard you say that if you
That's not
email,
because,
the syllabus would be available?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
what's what you're
it's
reading?
not because.
Not yet. Like I'm trying to work on a version of it. I'm trying to work on one version of it to put out in the publication that Critical Resistance puts out called The Abolitionist. And so I think they have an online version of it too. So I'm working on a short version of it for them, and I'm working on a longer version of it for that. But that probably will be out for a little while. But I'm working on a longer version of it for publication on some kind of scholarly venue, something.
Cool. Okay.
But yeah, no, stay in touch with me. And I'm totally happy to see you. So.
Awesome. That would
Yeah.
be wonderful. And
Yeah.
I'll look out for it.
Yeah, yeah.
That'd be like the next abolitionist, because I know one just came out.
Yeah, it'll be they want it. I don't know when the next one comes out. I was supposed to have it not for the one that just came out, but for the next one. So wish me luck. I think I can get it out. I think it'll be repetitive for you all. 'Cause it's just a version of what I did.
I love. It's a different form of
Yeah,
and taking
that's true.
information
No, that's true.
though.
That's true. No,
When you
it'll be
can
out
sit
there.
with it like that, it's different.
Yeah, yeah. No, see now I feel like some pressure to do it. So that's good. No, I'll do it. No, I'll
Do you
put
want
it
that?
out there.
Is that what you
No,
want?
that helps me.
Cool.
I'll put it out there. I'll put it out there for
Awesome.
because you're asking for it.
I want it.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks so much.
All right, yeah. Good to meet you guys.
Yeah, you
Oh man, depends on what I'm talking about. But like, for many years, because with kind of building on people's work, like the language of domestic warfare, I'll often use. I'll use the language of racist and/or gendered racist state violence.
Make comparisons is one way to do it.
I'll use the word incarcerating regime as opposed to mass imprisonment, because I want to think about how the regime of incarceration involves, it focuses especially jails and prisons, but it's more than jails and prisons, that the way people are captured and trapped spatially has a long history to it that extends beyond prisons and jails. Obviously the terms of the different ways in which we use the terms of genocide, racial colonial genocide. Folks started increasing the terms of occupation, separate colonial occupation, conquest, and that kind of thing. So it really depends on what context we're talking about, right? But in place of mass incarceration, I'll oftentimes just say this is targeted gender racist state violence. And I usually insist on looking at the policing, right? Because a lot of times, what folks will do is they'll focus on incarceration and criminal justice and let policing off the hook. And what it lends itself to is the kind of logic of reform that folks like Obama and Clinton, which is let's reform mass incarceration and strengthen the police. Right? And it makes sense within that logic. And it's partly our fault. Yeah, email me and stay in touch. Yeah, pleasure.
Allows at least for novels, I can't appreciate. And then the author is very technical, very stylistically.
Yeah, it'll be in the library eventually.
Their use of form and narrative and their use of language. I don't care about